Good evening and welcome to our Exodus study. I'm incredibly excited you decided to tune in with us. Today we're in Exodus chapter 19. Exodus 19. And we're really marking a turning point today. The text begins to shift because we're finding ourselves at a brand new place, and we're going to see that in verse 1. And this brand new place, they're going to stay in for the rest of the book. Not only are they going to stay there for the rest of the book, they're going to be there in this spot in Leviticus. They're going to be in this spot in Numbers. They're going to hang out at this spot, and this spot is probably one of the most significant places you'll read about in the Bible. And so today we're going to sit here with this text. I'm excited about it, and I want you to keep in your mind this idea of preparing yourself for presence. I want you to just, in the back of your mind, put that in your back of your mind, and I want to frame our discussion about being prepared for the presence of God. All right, Exodus chapter 19. I've got the NIV version open and the New Living Translation. It reads this way. It says, on the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. So it takes them 3 months to get to the Sinai, the Mount Sinai. Now, what's interesting to me is the distance here in all these places is not really far. But it takes them 3 months to get to the Sinai, the desert of Sinai, where we find the Mount Sinai. And if you don't know, Mount Sinai is in chapter 3, was where Moses had the burning bush experience. And it seems to be the central focus of where we find the presence of God throughout this book. And so they end up here on the third day after the Israelites left Egypt. They're in the desert of Sinai. Now, as they're in this place, I want us to chew on this idea that this is the same place where he has this experience. They're going to hang out here for a while. But traditionally, scholars don't believe that the Sinai Peninsula is the place. Now, what's interesting is if you were to visit the Sinai Peninsula today, the Sinai Peninsula is where people attribute the presence of God to be. So there's a monastery there. There's all kinds of tours, and people are, they're selling tours, come see where the burning bush was. But if we were to look archaeologically, it's believed that it was really in Midian that the desert of Sinai was, and that the Sinai Peninsula was named later. And so Midian is modern-day Saudi Arabia. And so it's believed that in modern-day Saudi Arabia, which would have made more sense geographically for where they have arrived. Now, that's just a bit of information for us to chew on, to think about, to get an understanding of where we're hanging out today. Also, for our background, in Galatians chapter 4, verse 25, Paul clearly describes it as Arabia, as the place where Sinai is. Let's keep reading. After they set out for Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So I want you to, there's a few things I want us to look at in this piece. First thing I want you to see is that God calls them in verse 3, he calls them both sons of Jacob and children of Israel. And what I want us to understand is sometimes God will refer to us as what we used to be, as well as referring to us as who we are. And then I want you to notice, as we deal with the children of Israel throughout the rest of the Bible, whenever you see God refer to them as the sons of Jacob, it means they've gotten out of the will of God. Now, why does that make sense? You remember in Genesis, God renames Jacob to Israel. He wrestles with God all night long. And when he's in the will of God, God calls him Israel. When he's out of the will of God, operating as a trickster in his flesh, he becomes Jacob. And so when we're reading between the lines in the text, I want us to understand that what you're seeing is God is referring to him by his nature. And so when God refers to him, he says, "You sons of Jacob, listen. You children of Israel," it gives me this idea that they're kind of hanging out on the fence. You got people among them who are really, their heart is really turned toward God. You also have people in this mixed multitude that are causing some falling. And we're going to see that unravel here in the next couple of chapters. And so I want us to think, I want you to ask the question, who are you today? You know, every day we have a battle, we have a fight. We talked even Sunday about it. But I want you to be aware, who are you today? Is your flesh showing up more? Or is your spirit man showing up more? Because if you're not aware, you'll go your whole life thinking you're righteous or you're holy and be so far off, and then you'll arrive at Judgment Day and God will be like, I didn't know you. I had no clue who you are because you operated according to the flesh. Now, what I also want us to notice here in verse 4, he says, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, we think about eagles. I want us to think for a second because eagles are a different kind of bird. A lot of birds, when they carry their young by their claws. Eagles perch their nests up so high that a baby bird could never fly there. And it requires this complete dependence on the mama bird. She separates them so far from civilization that they can't go wander off too far in their infancy. It creates this dependence on mama so that as long as I'm in my developmental phase, I've got to fly with mama. And as she teaches me how to fly like eagles and not chickens, or like eagles and not crows, soon I begin to learn how to fly high because the only place of home I've ever known is up high. Let me bring it down. Let me bring it down out the rafters. God has taken the children of Israel. And so when he makes it, says, I carried you on eagle's wings, he has taken the children of Israel, he has separated them so far from Egypt, put them in the middle of the wilderness so that they are so far from what they knew or what they know and so far from civilization that they had to make up in their minds that they were going to have complete dependence on God. And he doesn't release them out of the desert or out of their wandering season until they have learned that I can't operate or function without God. Let me bring it to you now that we've taken it to the text. There are times where God will isolate you. He'll make your friend group fall apart. He'll make you have some strife at home. He'll cause people at work not to care for you, and so that you can develop a complete dependence on him. That's, you know, the old folks would say trouble don't last always, but sometimes trouble isn't always from Satan. Sometimes it's from God, because God is asking the question, if I isolate you, if I take away from you everything that you've ever known, will you trust me? Will you depend on me? Will you wholeheartedly stretch out on me? Now, the other thing that I want you to see is that eagles, they don't carry their young by the claws. Usually when a bird picks up its young, it carries them by the claws and has them out front as it flies throughout the skies. Eagles don't do that. Eagles put their young on their backs so that if someone were to strike a bow or something was try to attack, it would hit the eagle before it hit the child. God is operating the same way. He did this when they were crossing the Red Sea. He put the angel and the Holy Spirit in between Pharaoh's army and the Israelites as they crossed over. He kept them from war with the Amalekites. So that when they were moving toward whatever God was moving them toward, when the trials would strike, they hit God first. And I want you to think about this, because often we think God is not listening. Often we think God is not hearing, he's not protecting us, and we're frustrated by the trials and tribulations we're going through. And so we're frustrated, we're angry, we don't understand why life is happening this way, and truthfully, the spear hit God before it hit you. Truthfully, the attack hit God before it hit you, and the amount that he allowed to hit you, it hit you so that it could strengthen you. There is nothing, no trial that you've ever experienced that God allowed too much to hit you. There's no trial There's no strike. Nobody ever attacked your character. Nobody ever attacked your body. That God wasn't in the middle of it, protecting you from it so that you could learn from the situation. It takes me back to, being a kid. At when I graduated high school, at my going away party, my dad told a story about how when I was a baby, he would put me on the bed and just knock me down. And when my mom would ask, "What are you doing?" He said, I'm teaching my kid how to fall so that my kid knows how to get back up. God does that to us. He allows things to hit us. But he carries us on his back. And the truth is when you're used to being carried on the back of God, sometimes you don't appreciate the protection. And so we have Bible studies like this to remind you that you're riding on his back, that it's eagle wings that are keeping you and protecting you and making sure that you're safe. All right, let's keep moving. Verse 3. I'll take that back. Verse 5. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Let's go back to verse 5. I want you to notice, he says, if you obey me fully, keep my covenant. Now in verse 4, God reminds the Israelites of what he's already done. And I want to remind us this evening, because I think we live in an age where it is popular to believe that Christianity is all about me. Name it, claim it. God, I need you to do. And we form our prayer life around what we want, what we need, and not necessarily about who God is and what he's done. I want you to notice in verse 5, he says, in verse 4, he tells them, this is what I did. I've carried you. I destroyed the Egyptians. I made sure that you were safe and protected. I delivered you out of bondage. I did all this stuff. Now in verse 5, he says, so if you obey my covenant, then I'm going to do this for you. What he's basically saying is, he's saying, I'm about to put some requirements on Israel. I'm about to tell you that you're going to have to do some stuff for me. And if you agree to do the stuff I tell you to do, it's going to come with some major benefits. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because he says, if you obey me and keep my covenant. I want to start here because most of us are familiar with contracts and not covenants. And there's a difference. Because while some people like to call contracts covenants, there's a difference, because a contract is usually between two people or two organizations, and it's on paper, and they've agreed to terms, they've signed it away, and there are going to be there's some mutual assent. So somebody's going to do something, both sides are going to have to do something, and not only is there mutual assent, there are things that happen in the event that you don't do it. That's a contract. But usually the terms are between the two people. The two people negotiated and came to a conclusion. The two organizations came to a room, they negotiated till they agreed on the terms. Well, a covenant is different in the way that the terms are public. That's why your marriage vows are a covenant and not a contract. And any two times we try to make it a contract and not a covenant, we've missed the point, because of the marriage vows were public. And because the marriage vows were public, the whole community or everybody who came is to hold you accountable. Now, we were like, this is between me and my wife. The truth is that if Sally Sue was at your wedding, Sally Sue witnessed what you told your wife. And since she witnessed what she told your wife, if she sees you doing something in contrast, it's her job as part of the people who witnessed the covenant take place to tell you, hey, I witnessed this, and you're not holding your end up of the covenant. And if you fail to turn around or to repent, church word, it's now incumbent upon her to go to that person, because the terms of the covenant are public. Now, so he says, if you fully keep my covenant, this isn't just between me and Moses. This isn't just between me and the people. This covenant is is for the whole earth. It's between me and Israel, but the whole earth is to witness. Now, I want you to notice this. He says, then out of all the nations you'll be my treasure possessions, although all the earth is mine. Let's keep reading for 6, verse 6. So Moses went back and summoned the elders and the people. So you'll be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Watch this. So this covenant is a public situation. This covenant is designed for the whole world to watch. I want you to notice this. Israel is a teeny tiny nation. It's a teeny tiny nation that seems to be at the center of the UN every time the UN comes together. It's a teeny tiny nation that the United States seem to be really concerned about making sure that they are aligned or disaligned with Israel. That it's a teeny tiny nation, but yet it's always at war. It's a teeny tiny nation. And I want you to see this because it's not just political. This isn't just new. This isn't something that happened in the last 20, 30 years. For since God made the declaration that Israel would be blessed and that they entered into a covenant, it has been something that the world has watched since the beginning. It's something that the world has witnessed. And I want you to see this. God doesn't make this covenant with them because he just wants them to be special. He makes this covenant with them so that they can witness to the whole world. Now let's go a little bit further. In the Old Testament, we see Sadducees and Pharisees come about, and it becomes custom for Israelites to clench their clothes when they walk in town. And they become so arrogant about their witness that they don't even want to be defiled, in air quotes, defiled by other people. And so they would walk through town as arrogantly as possible. I am the chosen people of God. Don't touch me. Don't come near me. And really the intent here with God was that you would be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So the goal here is not just the tribe of Levi would be priests, but that all of Israel would be representatives of God to the world. I want to say this because the church has fallen into the same syndrome that the Israelites fell into in the Old Testament, is that we think that our salvation or our direct connection with God and our sanctification, so our set-apartness, means that we cannot be around people. But the goal here, the whole reason God saved you, this whole reason God set apart the Israelites, is so that you can go and witness the glory of God to other people. Tell other people about who God is, what God has done, the doors God has opened, the ways God has made. Be a living testimony to his goodness. I want you to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. I want you to represent me well. I want you to be set apart, but I want when people see you, they know you're a Jew, not because you wear the little hat, not because you wear the thing on your forehead, not because you do anything special in your garments, but because of your behavior, because of the favor on your life, because of all of the good things that I've done, the ways I've made, and the doors I've opened in your life. So he makes this covenant, he makes this declaration to Moses to go down the mountain and to tell the Israelites. So verse 7. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought back their answer to the Lord. I'm going to go ahead and read verse 9, but I'm going to deal with verse 8. He says, the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. And then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. Okay, so verse 8, they say, the people respond, they said, we're going to do everything the Lord has said. And I wanted to say it, I'm going to say it very bluntly. They had the right heart, but their answer was ignorant. Because they entered into, they didn't have a clue. They didn't have a working understanding of God. Now, to me, that's weird because we just watched how God sent frogs and locusts and plagues and killed firstborns, swallowed up a whole army, opened up the sea. We just watched how people had boils and all kind of stuff just happened, and it was all at God's word that these things happened. But the people responded together, we're going to do everything God has said, because they were used to dealing with these deities that didn't have power. These deities that didn't have the ability to cause pain or goodness or mercy. So if God said, cool, we'll just do it. Sometimes we make declarations. God, I'm never going to do that again. If you'll get me out of this one. We make oaths, declarations, promises to God that we are not capable to keep in our own strength. And as we make those declarations, as we come to such conclusions, we set ourselves up to sin because sin is missing the mark. And how do you miss the mark when it's you that set the mark? And so we set ourselves up to be liars before God and to be unfaithful to the covenants we've made to God. But so the people had the right heart. Hear me. They had the right heart, the right intention. They were grateful to God, but their answer was so quick and quipped, it showed God that they did not understand who he was. And because they didn't understand who he was, he responds. And we're going to go ahead and read 9 and 10. He says, and then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. And the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day. Because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai and in the sight of the people. Watch this, verse 10, verse 9. God said, I'm coming down. I'm coming down. And we're going to have a chat with the multitude, but because the people still don't understand the gravity of who I am. Right now, I told you in the beginning that to Pharaoh and to the people that I would make you like God to them. That time is over. That time is over. It worked for a minute because they were questioning who I am. And clearly, it worked to scare Pharaoh, but it did not work to teach people how to reverence my presence. And I want us to see this because I remember a time in church when kids ran in the sanctuary, we were all afraid we were going to get our butts beat. And now that's not so much the case. I remember a time when we so revered, and it's not about the building. Let me be clear. It's not about the building. But we so revered the house of God. There were certain things we wouldn't do or say or even behave. The idea of eating in the sanctuary was unheard of. And now that we have, and I'm not talking against it. I want to give us some perspective. Now we have churches that do coffee and popcorn in the sanctuary, and it's normal because it allows people to come into the presence. But I want you to see, let me tell you the significance here. When you tell someone to wash their clothes in this day and age, that is symbolic of a life change. Everybody didn't have a whole closet full of clothes. They didn't get to make decisions about what they wore. They had the clothes on their back, and maybe you had some nice apparel, but you didn't have much, and especially if you're roaming around in the desert. And so he says, have them wash their clothes. Have them go and purify themselves. Have them consecrate themselves today and tomorrow. Prepare for my presence. Verse 11. And be ready by the third day, because on the day that the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all people. I want to ask you the question. When was the last time you prepared for worship? And I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about you trying to read the commentary on the way to Sunday school or you trying to pray on the way to church. When was the last time that on Saturday night you got yourself in a place, a posture of prayer? You woke up on Sunday morning and you worshiped before you got here. When was the last time that you made sure you were aware of what you were watching the night before you came to church? What you were aware your clothes were laid out on Sunday evening so that your mind could be stayed on Jesus the next morning. When was the last time you prepared for worship? Because basically what God is telling Moses is you can't just wake up and come in my presence. You can't just you can't expect to just march into my presence and have an experience with me as if I'm the guy next door. I love you. I want to hang out amongst you. I want to dwell amongst my people. That's been my goal since the beginning. But I'm not like you. I'm not like your sister or your brother. I am a holy God, and I require a holy people. And I think we have become so lax in an effort to attract people or to be convenienced that we've forgotten that we serve a holy God. Now, do I think that we got to be uptight and we got to wear big vestments and we got to be over the top and wear big hats? And no, I don't think that. But I think it's less about our clothing, because the clothing is symbolic of me not coming before God with my worst. We've become so lax about the presence of God that many of us don't even remember what it feels like. Many of us can't tell you his fragrance because we treat God as if he's one of the homeboys. Now, he's a friend, and this is a tight tension. He is your friend. He is your keeper. He is the lover of your soul, but he's not a human man. You can't approach him. And I think the best way to put it, what's funny is I turned 27 this year, and all of a sudden, I don't like it when little kids just call me by my name. I used to be, you just call me by my name. I'm just all of a sudden, when, especially little kids that I'm paying for stuff for, all of a sudden, I don't want you to just call me Cole. You need to call me Mr. Cole or Uncle Cole, or you need to put some respect on my name. And I used to think that was crazy. I was like, oh, these handles and these titles and stuff. It's not about titles. But what it is I know that I will never walk into my mama and daddy's house and say, hey, Vanessa and Brian. They will always be mama and daddy. And if one of my friends dares to say Vanessa and Brian, I'm going to correct them. That's Miss Vanessa. That's Miss Brian. Mr. Brian, I'm sorry, Daddy. That's Mr. Brian. I know that if I'm going to my grandparents' house, I will never say John and Carolyn. That's Grandpa and Grandpa. That's Grandma and Grandpa. And if one of my friends, they're not even Mr. John and Miss Carolyn, that's Mr. Fields and Mrs. Fields. They've earned the respect. They've earned the respect. It's a joke, you know, but my mama and Avery both say I'm not Mrs. Jones. That's my grandma. I'm Miss Vanessa or I'm Miss Avery, but Mrs. Jones was reserved for my grandmother because she's earned the respect. It's not about titles. She's lived long enough. She's served the family long enough. She's been in this world long enough that you put some respect on her name. And we live in a society where we don't want to respect anybody. We think everybody's our peer, and that's not the case. And it's not the person being elevated, it's you respecting the office they sit in. And if we serve a God who's higher than our ways, whose thoughts are higher than our thoughts, whose behaviors are way beyond our what we encompass, we've got to come before him differently. And so he says on the third day, after you've taken 3 days to clean yourself up, then I'm going to come down, and you're really not going to be clean enough even then, but then I'm going to come down, and I'm going to come down for the sight of the people to give them some perspective of who I am. And then he gives them some more instructions. He says, be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain and touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. Now, I want you to notice this. He then gives them some parameters on distance. Now, I want to give you some perspective because I'm going to teach this like this is Old Testament because it is. This is where we get the veil. So before there's a temple, before there's a tabernacle, this is the separation that God puts between man and God because he's a holy God. And so he says nobody can come past the mountain or even touch the rock on the mountain unless you're Moses and Aaron and I sent for you. Now, I think it was Beyonce several years ago that said, don't come for me unless I send for you. Literally, God created the concept. Literally, he said, don't come up here. Don't touch my area. And then he tells them, he says, you kill people if they think that they have enough wherewithal to approach the throne of grace without permission. He says, you put them to death. Don't put them in jail. Don't slap their hand. Don't punish them. Don't fine them. Kill them. This is how serious this is. And I want us to understand, it's not like that now. You can say Heavenly Father and God is there listening. We have access now. But I think in our access, some of us have lost our respect. And so while you have access, we still have to have a certain level of respect. So he says, there'll be stoned or shot with arrows, and not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. When the ram's horn sounds, they may approach the mountain, but that doesn't mean they can touch the mountain. Let's go on to 14. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Let's keep going. And then he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. So I want you to see this. This is not just about my clothes. This is the state of my soul. Now, I want you to recall, this is pre-law. Now, next chapter, we're going to begin to get the law. We're going to get the 10 Commandments. But this is pre-law. This is people are having sex with other people. Marriage is kind of written on the heart because God made that in the beginning. But people are out here doing what they do. Humans are animals. I don't know if y'all know that. But he's saying don't touch your wife and don't touch the girl down the street. Because when you come before my presence, not only does your body need to be clean, your soul needs to be clean. And that's a whole discussion for a whole other day. But at the end of the day, every time you go have sex with somebody, you're tying up your spirit and your soul to another person. You're losing pieces of yourself. So he says, abstain from sexual relations, take a bath, clean your clothes, set yourself apart. Let's go on to 16. On the morning of the third day, there was a thunder and a lightning. And with a thick cloud over the mountain, there was a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. And the smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Let me go back to 16, because I want you to see this. God announces himself, he's back, by a very loud trumpet blast. Now, based on the research that I've done, this is not some natural trumpet. Like, this is not like a trumpet that I bought from Arts Music Store. This is a trumpet from heaven. It is believed that this is like the trumps we're going to hear when the rapture happens. This is when the trumpet judgments go forth. This is the sound from heaven they hear. The trump sounds, and everybody in the camp is like, whoa, what's happening? Now I want you to imagine you're sitting out here minding your own business, and a sound from heaven sounds. Now, we this whole time we're thinking, God is like God, all these other beings, and we're doing life as normal. We've had to consecrate ourselves. We've had to prepare ourselves, and all of a sudden, supernatural intervention now. It's kind of one of those things where any two times we're operating in the physical realm and the supernatural intervenes in a way that our physical eye can see it, it startles you. And so it says, everyone in the camp trembled. Everybody's getting nervous. And I think that's kind of God's goal here. He's not trying to make you scared, but he's kind of trying to instill some fear. You know, scared means that I think that I'm about to die. Fear says that, okay, there's some respect here. There's some respect here. Verse 17. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Can you imagine there's a meeting with God? Like, this is not the principal. This is not the CEO of your company. God scheduled a meeting because he wanted to get some understanding. Can you imagine? I don't know if y'all got spankings. I did. There's a feeling you get. Your butt clenches up when you know you being caught on the carpet. There's this fear, this reverence that immediately comes about. Let's go on to verse 18. Mount Sinai. And so not only does God call a meeting, but Mount Sinai is covered in smoke. It just got dark because the Lord descended in fire. Now you remember God shows up here in Exodus 3 as a burning bush. And so he's choosing a similar form. He shows up in fire. This is this fire that comes down, probably filling the whole mountain. The smoke billows up, and it's like a smoke from a furnace, so it's a thick, dark, black smoke, and the whole mountain begins to tremble. I want you to picture this. It's like an earthquake is happening. The whole mountain is trembling because even the mountain is aware of the presence of God. And I want us to sit here because I'm reading this book called The Celebration of Discipline, and it talks about how the chapter I read today was talking about study. One of the things it says to study is to study creation. And it talked about this morning about this rabbi who every morning would get up at 5 a.m. and he would go out and he would go to the creek to listen to the song that the frogs worshiped God with. And he would sit there and study the song of the frogs. Could you imagine when the mountain begins to worship? The mountain begins to tremble violently because God's presence shows up. I want you to see something, that when the presence of God shows up, all of creation has to worship. When the presence of God falls, when God organizes a meeting, even the things that we say are inanimate become animate. And even Scripture tells us that if you will not worship, if you will not cry out, the rocks will cry out on your behalf. And so God shows up. The smoke billows up. There's, if we were to look at it, it would seem like a whole lot of theatrics, but this is before we have theater. Like, this is God showing up all by himself. He shows up, the smoke happens, and the mountain begins to tremble violently. Verse 19. And the sound of the trumpet gets louder and louder. So basically, the angels are playing, God is descending, and Moses spoke, and the voice of God speaks. Now, up until this point, Moses has been the voice of God. Moses goes up the mountain, God tells him what to say. Moses comes back down, he tells them what God said. Moses gets in the presence of God, he tells him what to say. He goes and tells the people. At this point, God is speaking for himself. Can you imagine what a trip it is if you've been thinking that Moses is God this whole time? You've been putting your faith and trust in Moses, so when you get mad at God, you think you're mad at Moses. And all of a sudden, this being that you've never seen descends, it's trumpets flaring, and put this in perspective. It's trumpets playing, and we didn't even know what trumpets were. The mountain, which we thought was stable and would never move, is shaking, and all of a sudden, there's smoke from nowhere. And then God said, Moses makes a statement like, your servants are here, and God speaks. And all you see is fire and smoke. Can you imagine what that does to your lackadaisical nature? Can you imagine what that does to your behavior? I want you to notice The few times we see people have an encounter with God in the Bible, it is all striking. You know, it is Isaiah who says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. We see John in Revelation, when he encounters God, he describes it as something that he faints. He sees God, he faints, he covers his face because it was so amazing to see. He immediately faints, and then when he comes to, he worships. And I know that we find issue fathoming what the presence of God is like. But I would tell you this. It is more powerful than anything you've ever experienced in church. It is sweeter than any of the most peaceful moments you've ever seen. And it will strike fear in the hearts of men. God answers him, verse 20. Verse 20. The Lord descended on top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. And so Moses went up, verse 21. And the Lord said to him, go down and warn the people so they don't force their way through to see the Lord. And many of them perish. So basically, God says, I created these fools, and I know that what's going to happen is they're over here awestruck, and once they come to, they're going to force their way up because now their nosiness wants to see. And so but I want you to think about this. So Moses has physically had to climb up to the top of this mountain. He's got to go back down there and corral them and say, now look, don't come across this line because it's going to cause you some problems. And now he's got to climb back up the mountain. I was reading a commentary today, and the guy had actually been to Mount Sinai, and he said he went up there one morning at 3 a.m. to see the sunrise by 6, and he thought about this text, and he said that as exhausted as he was coming back up, the idea that Moses had to climb up this thing regularly back and forth to be in communion with God and man had to be extremely exhausting. But God tells him that God cares about them. I want you to notice this. God cares about them so much that although they are callous or lackadaisical about who he is, he cares about them enough to say, Moses, I know my children. Go make sure that they don't cross the line. And I want you to see this. God does that for you all the time. You'll be about to sin, go somewhere that's going to hurt you, do something that's going to hurt your future, and all of a sudden, people said, I don't know what you're doing, but God told me to tell you not to WXYZ. I don't know what you're thinking about doing, where you're thinking about going, but God told me to tell you. God, all of a sudden, you headed somewhere, you got a brand new car, but the brand new car won't start because God is trying to keep you from falling, and he's trying to keep you from walking into your own death, your own detriment. And so he says, go down there, tell them so that they don't perish. Let's go on to 22. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. So he goes down there, he's telling them all this stuff. But I want you to notice what God does is, even though I've consecrated the firstborn, even though I'm going to consecrate priests, even though I'm setting down parameters, what I want you to understand is that nobody is above being consecrated to me. Not the pastor, not the minister, not the person that prays super duper long and sounds super duper deep. Everybody has to consecrate themselves to be before God. And I heard this said in a Bible study a couple of weeks ago. God promises unconditional love, but he does not promise us unconditional relationship. All throughout this Bible, and this is the second time we see it, all throughout this Bible, what we see is that you're going to have to come before God a certain way. After the fall of man, if there's no blood applied, if you haven't been consecrated, if you haven't been cleansed, if you haven't come before, now that we're under the new covenant, if you haven't confessed and believed, you can't come before God. You don't have access. And no matter your position, it does not matter because we serve a holy God. We don't just serve a deity. We don't just serve some enlightened one. We serve a God who is holy and flawless. And our sinful state has no business in his perfection without cleansing. Verse 23. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up from Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. Let's keep reading. And the Lord replied, go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come to the Lord, or he will break out against them. This is the second time he says this. He says, if the people come out, I know I put parameters around it. I know I told you that you were to kill them, but I want you to understand, if y'all start touching this mountain, y'all start coming up here, y'all are going to have to fight God. You're going to have to fight God. And I don't know about you, but fighting God is petrifying to me. Coming against what, even the will of God is petrifying to me. You think about this. We are mortal. Not only are we mortal, we are fallible. Not only are we fallible, we're limited. Now we serve a God who's immortal, who's infallible, and who's unlimited. How could you even compare the two to say that you're going to go against him? But God says, he says, I'm going to break out against them if they try to force their way up this way. Verse 25. So Moses went down to the people and he told them, tomorrow we're going to start, not tomorrow, next week we'll begin. Next week we'll begin, and we're going to talk about the 10 Commandments. He's going to give the 10 Commandments. But what I want you to see this is sometimes we get a little full of ourselves. Sometimes we get to the place where we think that we are entitled, and I think we see that on display everywhere, from presidents to leaders in the community to even citizens. We get to the place where we're like, well, don't you know I'm a kingdom kid? Don't you know that I'm a citizen? Don't you know that I am this? Your entitled self can't build relationship with God until you humble yourself. And I want to just insert a secret. The Bible tells us to humble yourself before Almighty God. And sometimes I hear people pray, Lord, humble me. That's the last thing you want. Because God humbling you sounds like the Lord breaking out against you. Sounds like you being humiliated. That's what happens when somebody else humbles you. It means that you're publicly put to shame. And so God realized that the hearts of men were not righteous. They weren't holy. And so he tells Moses to warn them several times. Does God have to warn you about how you enter his presence? Does God have to constantly remind you to stop trying him, testing him, putting him to the test? Or have we made it to the place of humility where we realize who God is? Because God had to come down and have a meeting with the people so the people could put in perspective who he was. And even after he put it in perspective, he showed them who he was. And not just this day, but all the days where he was doing miracles and plagues, the people still didn't have a clue. And dare I submit to you that the church often has forgotten who it is we serve. Because if you knew who you served, you would walk different. You would talk different. We would behave different. And so I want to admonish you to consecrate yourself. Prepare your heart for worship. And see what God does when you enter his presence. Y'all pray with me. God, we thank you for your grace, your mercy, your power. God, I thank you. I do not take lightly the privilege of teaching and preaching. I don't take light the privilege of prayer. God, I know that there is no distance in prayer, and so wherever people may be as they listen, God, I pray that you would fill them up. I pray that you would show up in a mighty way and that you would remind people that God is still alive. He is still powerful. He is still mighty, and he's still working miracles. But God, above miracles, I pray that we would learn to value your presence. God, I pray that you would redeem our time, keep us, protect us. And God, until we meet again, I pray that you would just hold us in the cradle of your arms. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. We'll catch you next week, and y'all be blessed.